You are listening to the Breaktime Tech Talks podcast, a bite-sized tech podcast for busy developers, where we'll briefly cover technical topics, news snippets, and more in short time blocks. I'm your host, Jennifer Reif, an avid developer and problem solver with special interest in data, learning, and all things technology. Apologies for missing last week's episode, but I've been a bit under the weather. And it's also really easy to get lost in the overwhelming amount of content out there too. Staying on top of all the tech today is hard, and I'm so many installments behind on my many newsletters, subscriptions, and feeds. But this week, I tried a little bit harder to balance the content consumption and production a bit better by soaking in an Andrej Karpathy interview that people have been talking about, as well as producing this episode, writing for an upcoming Java book, and reviewing Neo4j Graph Academy courses. Let me share what's going on. First up, I had mentioned a few weeks ago that I created a GraphRag Fundamentals course that is through O'Reilly, and I produced the first installment there. And I wanted to create a Langchain4j version of the application to go along with the primary Spring AI version that I had together, but I couldn't because Langchain4j didn't allow for a read-only Neo4j database because of the vector index. So you could run with a Neo4j read-only database in traditional queries and things like that, but to do the vector indexing, it tries to create the vector index inside the database and so requires write access. That has now changed. There was an update to Langchain4j that got pushed out, I think a couple of weeks ago now, where that capability is in Langchain4j. So I thought I would go back and work on the Langchain4j version of the application. The first thing that kind of tripped me up was that it was pushed in the Langchain4j community library. So I needed to add that into my project in order to take in the latest release of that project because it's not in the core project as of yet. So that was a little bit tricky to figure out, okay, what library works with this version? Does my version of Neo4j or Langchain4j or Quarkus need updated in order to be compatible with all of that? It was a little bit of versioning headaches in order to figure all that out first. The second thing is that frameworks approach things a little bit differently. And it's taking me a little bit longer to make some design decisions. First off, Spring AI will format and construct your classes and the way that the pipelines move and run throughout the application a little bit differently than what Quarkus does with Langchain4j. I could absolutely pull in Langchain4j into my Spring app, but I figured if I'm differentiating between using Spring and something else, then I might as well use something else for the framework as well. So I went with Quarkus and Langchain4j. That's what I'm building. And because Quarkus takes a slightly different perspective, then their structure, their design of their application is going to be slightly different. So that's slowing me down just a little bit, just making some design decisions about which way do I want to go for this particular function and this particular capability. Also, I have found out that Claude isn't the greatest at complex cipher generation, especially when you're dealing with brand new features. For instance, Neo4j recently released Cypher 25, which is the latest installment of Cypher for this year, and it has some really nice features and capabilities included, but also your major LLMs aren't going to be trained on that data yet, right? It's out there available on the web, but it's not part of their training, and so the syntax that they're going to go with, that they're going to generate, is going to be out of date or older syntax. So it's maybe not as clean, not as easy to maintain or read. And so I wanted to update and fix some of that and use some of the new syntax. But when you're trying to do this new bleeding edge stuff, it's always hard to have an AI generate that. It's a lot of learning, going to documentation yourself, building it yourself, which is no problem, but it does kind of slow that work down just a little bit. AI is great at generating some things, not so great at other things. This is one of the things they don't handle so well, at least not yet. So I'm putting together this Langchain4j app, but it is taking me a bit longer to do so with some of these roadblocks and hiccups along the way. Now, I also am working through some of the Neo4j Graph Academy courses. I have built content for one or two of these courses, but I hadn't gone through the full library of everything that's available on Graph Academy. I really wanted to explore what was out there and just see what the courses are, how they work, little tidbits I might be able to pick up about Neo4j or technology in general. And I wanted to see what was in them. Now, the first course I tackled was the Gen AI Fundamentals course. And this course walks through how large language models work, how you end up with hallucinations, and how adding context can help reduce those. Talks a little bit about RAG introduction concepts, how it understands a user query, then retrieves related information using semantic search or vectors, and then provides an improved answer based on that context. Then the course goes into knowledge graphs, what they are, how to create one, and then integrating Neo4j with generative AI, looking at retrievers, things like the vector retriever, vector plus cipher, so a traditional graph rag retriever, if you want to think of it that way, and then a text to cipher retriever, and then talks a little bit about graph rag pipelines and frameworks and so on. The thing that I really love about these courses is that they blend some concepts, so some traditional reading lecture style stuff, with real world examples and hands-on. This feels really manageable at each step, no matter where you're coming from in your learning journey and no matter what programming language or framework you're most familiar with. I really like this course. I hope to showcase a little bit more about the course and a few tidbits here coming up, but that's where I am right now. I also am still working on my book project, and one of the things that I'm learning pretty firsthand is that my blog post writing and book writing are totally different. Now, I knew they would be different, but I felt like I was at least somewhat prepared from my blog post because I like to produce blog posts that are step by step. And when I have longer form content, I break it up into smaller chunks. So think chapters or sections or what have you. However, book writing is totally different, even from multi-step blog posts, because there's more context that you fill in the book, rather than leaving some things for the user to figure out. In a traditional blog post, you'll make some assumptions about what they know, what they don't know. You might expect they'll go out to resource links or run searches and fill in some of the gaps that they don't know. But a book, you don't really want that to happen. You want to fill in all those gaps as much as you can. And it took me a while to get into the groove. I worked through the first couple of chapters off and on, and then came back and started chapter 3 a while back, and chapter 3 just started to flow much better. And I think it was because I finally hit my groove and figured out, oh, this is how book writing is different from my traditional blog post writing, and this is what I need to change and alter in order to get into that. I've also noticed too that it's harder to focus for those longer periods of time. Yes, blog post writing takes time, but it's much shorter installments and shorter editing and feedback and publication cycles, where in a book writing scenario, you could sit and write for hours and hours and hours and hours and still not be done. So it's much more about, I need to break this up into smaller chunks. I need to do a section, or I need to work on the outline, or I need to work on examples. And you try to break it up into a little bit smaller pieces so that your brain doesn't get too fatigued, but it is a little bit of a different format and scenario than what I'm used to. I do also have a couple of upcoming activities for the month of December. I mentioned this in my last podcast episode, so here are the details for these. The first is I mentioned a Neo4j Fundamentals Gen AI hands-on workshop. This is from Neo4j, and it is entirely free. It's entirely virtual, so you can find this on the Neo4j events page. I will also leave the link in the show notes. But this is December 11th, and it's a virtual workshop. I think it's maybe 2.5 hours long, and it walks through Neo4j fundamentals with generative AI. And this is a little bit different from another virtual presentation I'm going to be giving, or virtual training I'm going to be giving, on the graph rag fundamentals. This is the O'Reilly 3-hour course. This is another installment of it. This will be December 18th. And if you don't have access to O'Reilly, you can sign up for a 30-day trial. Now, of course, that'll only give you 30 days in order to soak in as much content as you want to for free. But if you're interested in testing that out or just seeing what all is available, you can absolutely do that. In fact, I had a colleague who did that for my last course. So that was really exciting to be able to pass that along to you. All right, I mentioned early in the episode that I sat down and watched the Andrej Karpathy interview. I will leave the link in the show notes for the YouTube video. It is very long, over 2 hours, I think, but it is worth the listen. I did it in small chunks, kind of watched a chunk, then came back later. And there's a couple of highlights that I wanted to boil down and repeat back to you for today. But feel free, I would definitely encourage you to watch the interview, even if it's just in small pieces or chunks over time. The first thing that I wanted to highlight from that is Andrej talks about that LLMs are amazing but they're not. My take on this is there are certain things that large language models can do that are really spectacular and really amazing. But when they fail pretty miserably. And they talk a little bit about that, some scenarios where we're still trying to figure out where they excel and where they fail. That's still some of the learning journey that we're doing. Another point from the interview is that they talked about the decade of agents versus the year of the agent. Andre's perspective is that it's a decade of agents, which means that we're going to be seeing this longer term than just 2026. And my take on this is that it does seem to be the way the industry is leaning heavily on those agents, where each technology is a piece in the overall tech stack. So for instance, whether you're looking at, graphs or vectors or deployments or guardrails or whatever it happens to be, then each technology is going to have a piece of that puzzle, a piece of that pie, but it's a much larger stack when you're looking at a full application or a full system. The third point that I found really interesting, which was towards the end of the video, is that they talked about education, the importance of it and the shift of it with AI. Andre's point was that you really understand something when you can teach it, or you realize how little you understand when you can't explain it to someone else. My take on this is that it's exactly my perspective. When I started at Neo4j, I took the path that the best way to learn quickly was to focus on teaching the content. So that's exactly what I did. And I really loved this method of learning. It forced me to learn the technology through deep understanding and hands-on usage. It also gave me a different perspective when I was learning, that I want to learn this technology so well that I can help other people understand it and use it as well. And so I really thought this was a fun learning experience. I got a lot out of it, and I learned a whole lot just in my first year working at Neo4j, the graph database company, than I would have if I had come in and just learned things as I went along. The last thing I want to point out is that Nodes 2025 recordings are being added to the playlist. I will link that playlist again. There were lots of sessions that happened throughout the Nodes 2025 conference that was entirely virtual and 24 hours long back at the beginning of November. Those recordings from those sessions are now being consistently added to the playlist, so feel free to check those out if you missed them or if you want to see what all the hype was about. I've been finding it difficult to balance between content consumption and production because I feel always behind on consumption. I feel like I could spend full time on simply listening and reading news, interviews, videos, trainings, etc. But this week I tried harder to balance by doing some listening, but also generating new things as well. Human generation, not AI. I feel like I should distinguish that. As always, thanks for listening and happy coding.